bored people. Anyway, no, of course it can. Yeah. Good afternoon and welcome to You and Your Business with me, Alec Drew, on 103.2 Dublin City FM. Each week, I invite an expert from the world of business to share their knowledge, insights, and tips to help you with your business challenges. If there's a topic you would like covered, or if you feel that you can make a contribution, please email me at yourbusiness@dublincityfm.ie, and perhaps we'll be chatting here one day soon. My guest today is a podcaster and former radio show host. He is a business coach specializing on listening skills, and he is the active listening coach. I'm delighted to welcome Don Harris to the You and Your Business studio. Hiya, Don.
Good afternoon, Alec. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Long time no see, but it's great. And we'll show the connection to the show later when we have a chat. But right. you know the format of the show by now. I take people back to school. What was your last year in school like? Were you that academic? Were you going to head off around the world and build an empire? What were you doing?
I was very fortunate in my school, and I lived locally in a place called Sutton, and I went to school in a place called Holt. And I was very lucky. I was able to cycle or even walk to school. I really enjoyed it. So sport was hockey and a bit of football, but really hockey was the game. And then there was a great personal development ethos in the school. So I had a very happy school, and I was very lucky. No, I wasn't terribly academic. And
right.
I think that was brought over to me gently in various ways by various good teachers and parents. But I was the guy, and this was interesting in retrospect because it's where I am now. I was the guy that was asked to show around new pupils when they arrived. Don will bring them around. He's good at that. So I think somewhere along the line, my schooling was preparing me for dealing and listening to people, and I enjoyed it. I think that's what happened.
Excellent. Well, I'm delighted you had such a good school life. But this was to lead you on into the workplace. So how was that for you? What was your sort of first experience of exposure to the real world?
Yeah. Well, there was no such thing really as career guidance in the 70s. It's a new thing. But so in those days, there was a lady, and she was very nice and very helpful. But all I got was, you'd be very good at sales.
All right.
There's a way about you. You'd be very good at sales. And that was kind of it. I'm sure there were a few tests along the way, but it didn't seem to me like there was no notion of, so I'm going to put you in touch with this person or that person and go and have a chat, see the place. There was no opportunity to go and visit various organizations and see what they were like in any sort of, notional ideas of progressing into the company. So I quickly decided, okay, if I'm good at sales, that's what I should do. And I saw an ad in I think it was the Irish Times. There weren't that many papers doing ads and jobs and so on. And it was for a trainee manager in Switzer's department store, Grafton Street, Dublin. So within about 6 weeks of leaving school, I was in Switzer's on Grafton Street, which, by the way, out of interest, the staff don't go in the front entrance. You go around the back and end up going to the tunnel.
I'd well believe it, but you certainly picked one of the pillar brands in Ireland, actually, to get your first job in.
Yes, indeed, I knew where I was going. But I didn't have an idea really of what I was going to do, in all honesty. It was a question of, I'll try this and see how I like it. I did like it, and they were good people, and I enjoyed it.
I'd say it was a bit of a culture shock. I mean, coming from school straight into work, I think is a culture shock for everybody, but certainly back in those days.
Yeah, there was a discipline involved. You had to get up early, which I was always an early person anyway, so that wasn't really a difficulty. But you have to go in. I used to go in on the train from Hoth into town, which in those days were like cattle wagons. And they were so busy. I do remember a couple of occasions where people had to fall in through the window that just slid down with the leather handle.
I remember them, yeah.
And there was a sort of a when the door closed, and they would all pile in. A lot of people standing, and that was a forerunner to the Dart. But it got me there, and I enjoyed the walk. I was living in Hoth at that stage. Walked down the hill, got on the Dart, met some people on the way, got off the Dart, and here I am saying the same thing. The train,
yeah.
And got off at Tara Street. I think I used to get off it.
Yeah.
And I walked up. It was lovely. I enjoyed it.
How did you find this sort of training program that the Switzers had in place?
I'm not sure if it was a training program. I started, and I was given a job in the linen department of Switzer's, and I suppose I was guided through things by other people who were doing sales, who had been there a while. And I guess the manager, who I didn't really like at that particular time, so I was already a bit forthright. But look, he was good. He did his job very well, and of course, the whole focus had to be on customers and looking after them. And those days, Switzer's was one of the prime department stores in the country. So the type of customer that came in were of a certain middle class and upper class. And just to give it some geography, Brown Thomas were on the opposite side of the street to where Switzer's were. But it was a very prime location, and still is, of course.
In terms of, again, dealing with this whole customer culture, I suppose while you may not have had a formal training program, there was an expectation around employees and how they engage with customers. And I suppose those disciplines were put in place.
Definitely. There was a skill there, and you were definitely, one of the things I remember was you never stood around doing nothing. If you didn't have a duster in your hand, you were in trouble. So you were dusting shelves, lifting things, and looking busy. When you wanted to go to the gents, excuse me, which is in the basement,
all right,
you could say it to anybody. So there was never any awkwardness. You would say, "I'm going to the culinary department, Mr. Drew." And somebody, your colleague, would say, "Oh, fine, see you later." And the customer would say, "No." So nobody knew what the culinary department, but anyway, that's what it was.
Fantastic.
So and the other thing that my abiding memory of that, there were skillful people in salesmen. There was definitely, I got training from the other people there. So I guess their brief was to nudge me along. And then I did become an assistant manager in the department after about a year and a half or so. So that was helpful. There was a few of those. But one of the things that used to happen in Switzerland, and this was an eye-opener for me, was that the door onto Wicklow Street was a bit of a haven. And it wasn't unknown at all for somebody to arrive in with a black plastic bag, usually two people. And if you weren't aware of it, and I was in the linen department, so if you can think about it, there was pillowcases, sheets, not even duvets. Duvets were just coming in, and somebody would stand at one end of the shelf and somebody would push from the other end of the shelf, and a large number of pillowcases, sheets, and other things that fitted would end up in the black plastic bag, and two people are out Wicklow Street door very quickly.
Well, I'm afraid pilfering is still a part of the retail trade. But you mentioned also that there was somebody in head of what we'd call HR now, but would have been personnel back then. That was quite good.
Yes, this was my first realization of what personnel, as it was called then, was all about. And I thought she was a very approachable, likable person and very helpful. And if you did have a need for a bit of guidance or a thought, you would always be able to go and have a chat with somebody in personnel. There was a few people, but she particularly was very, I felt, good at her job. And I do think they were very good at looking after staff and bringing staff through a process. I didn't stay that long. I was only there about 2 years in the end because I was eager to see what was next for down in life. I didn't really know what I wanted. I just began to know what I didn't want.
When we were chatting,
sorry, Alec, yes.
No, when we were chatting, you mentioned that one of her core skills was listening, which was to be an important part in your life later.
Yeah, I think that's what I realized, that both listening to customers and listening to people like this lady was very important. And she was a good listener. So you understood when you were being listened to and when you were being disregarded. I think that was my first early understanding of that.
Okay, so as you mentioned, there are 2 years. Where are you off to next, or what did you got in mind? Or you obviously had some hobbies and things you were doing as well.
Yeah, I enjoyed DIY. So around about that time, I was I'd already made a canoe out of plywood and stuff. Then I made a mirror dinghy, which was, in those days, was made by a kit. You bought the kit, and it kind of was all sewn together with copper wire and fiberglass tape. So I did that and was lucky to be able to do that. I was good with my hands. I was good with doing DIY. I've always enjoyed that. And I felt I was creative. I wasn't good at drawing or painting, but I did have this creative side to me.
Right.
And as things went on, it did seem that the sales was going to be something in my life. So I drifted through a few different sales jobs. I sold ladies' clothes at one stage from a manufacturer in Eastmoreland Lane.
All
I
right.
found myself back in Switzerland, actually, to the people who were buying. I sold kitchens. I sold burglar alarms and became a surveyor of properties for burglar alarms. But along the way, I had drifted into another aspect of things that I think you're probably going to talk about soon, which also involved listeners, but I wasn't doing the listening this time.
Yeah, go on. So what did
Pirate
you?
Radio. Pirate
Oh,
Radio.
Pirate Radio. My goodness me, that takes me back some time. And for our listeners out there who may not be familiar, just explain a bit about Pirate Radio and why it was so important to the culture of the people back then.
Yeah, well, in the 60s and 70s, particularly in Ireland and into the 80s, the only broadcaster in Ireland was RTE Radio and RTE Television. So it was national, and there was nothing local on the radio side of things. So pirate radio stations started to set up in various places. And my first one was in the Hotel Victor on Rochestown Avenue in Dunleary in a bicycle shed. And it was called it's called Southside Radio. And I got an opportunity to do a little thing there for just for 2 weeks because a friend of mine had been doing a program there and he went off and I was hooked, and I just loved the whole idea of presenting records. And I did, of course, love music. So that's what happened then over the period. Totally unpaid, by the way. This was all voluntary. There was no money changing hands at all. We did all these jobs on pirate radio stations of an hour or two a week playing your own records, more or less. And then I was doing other sales jobs to earn a living at the same time.
Yeah, and that's quite interesting because in terms of, as you said, you had a love of music, but really you were filling a gap that the national broadcaster wasn't able to fill.
Yeah, at the time that was it. They didn't have the remit, and I think there was a lot of entrepreneurship around in those days to offer an alternative, and it proved to be a wanted alternative. It proved to be very effective at both local level and then as time went on at a national level on a network platform idea of being able to use radio stations to get a message out locally. And interestingly, as time went on, which was unusual, but it happened. The only places where obituary notices or deaths were recorded was in the local newspaper. And it
Right.
was funerals locally are terribly important in rural communities. They're really very much a fabric of the community. And radio stations, pirate radio stations as well, started to read out what were known as the death notices at the time. And it was totally unusual and a bit uncomfortable for a while. But it became a very, very useful service because the reality of it was local newspapers came out on once a week, Wednesday,
Sure.
Thursday, or Friday, or something like that. Radio stations were all the time. So if somebody, passed away 4 days before the newspaper was coming out, people didn't know, but the radio station did and was able to pass the news. So it was a very important service as it transpired.
Yeah, and literally that was the forerunner to something, an important service and fabric of the community as it was to become. But I suppose one of the real challenges around these radio stations would have been in terms of finance. And so therefore you got involved in helping them raise finance through advertising. Tell us a bit
Yes,
more about that.
that's how that came about. Well, it was a natural thing. You've got listeners, you need to pay the bills, and you figure out a way of getting paid for messages that go out. It's the tried and trusted. It's the same now in social media, the same in everything. You have a service and people want it, you can attract advertising. So that's what happened. So the only way in those days, though, there was no listenership research to find out if an ad was working, was to use a telephone number in that local advertiser's ad. So if it was a furniture store or any sort of a place, you use the telephone number, and you had to make sure that telephone rang plenty of time in that place to make sure that they knew that campaign was working. So that was the only audience research there was in those days. But it worked. It was very effective. It paid bills. It's a lot of radio stations, there were pirate radio stations in those days, survived, and they became independent radio stations. They became real local radio, if you like. And it wasn't until that was taken away, or the government got a bit more active about deciding we needed proper radio and we couldn't just have pirate radio, that things moved on a bit and it formalized.
And you sort of turned that more into a business at the time, if I'm not mistaken, the whole
Yep,
advertising side of it.
I did. It became a real interest for me. I had also worked for the RNLI into the 80s, had worked for the RNLI as an assistant national organizer there. And one of the things I started doing there was selling their advertising in their national magazine to, which is the Lifeboat magazine. So then I kind of realized that selling advertising wasn't that bad, even though I didn't know that much about it. So I became the central agent, if you like, for selling national advertising on local radio stations, which were pirate radio stations. So there was a network of about 8 or 10, and I formed a company called Airtime Limited to do that. And so I became an unofficial sales agent for about 8 or 10 local stroke pirate radio stations. I was in Dublin and they were all around the country.
Well, in fact, what you had found was a niche marketplace because the large ad agencies who would have been your natural competitors didn't have the same access you had. And plus, also, you had a working knowledge of these radio stations and connections in them.
Completely. And they were very popular and they had local branches. So if you took an insurance company as an example, they would have a national message, but they'd have very much a local office for people to go to. So the idea was you made an ad. Advertising usually is about 30 seconds long. It can be 15, it could be other ones. But if it was a 30-second ad, you would make a 20-second national ad or be supplied with a 20-second national ad. And then a 10-second one at the end would say, your local office here is Joey Malone Limited at 15 Main Street, or something like that. And that would be the local voice onto the national ad. That's how it all grew. That's how it all grew.
Right. And so it was a case of being able to adapt to a local marketplace, which really had a real need for this form of advertising.
Yeah, it was. It served a purpose for small businesses that didn't really have an opportunity to advertise except in the regional newspapers and local newspapers, which were a very strong force and extremely useful in the community, and was a very vibrant situation. So if you like, radio came along and started to challenge that as another local advertising opportunity. So that was the only two. Became either regional newspapers or local newspapers and the local radio station.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you took your love of radio in terms of, working there as a DJ, plus also the fact that you understood the impact they had on the local community. And then also you, obviously with the RNLI, you had sort of an interest in charity, and that was to lead on to, if I'm not mistaken, the Samaritans in some way. Maybe you might
Yes,
tell us more about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I absolutely loved my job with the RNLI, with the Irish Lifeboats. I got the opportunity to travel all parts of the country that I've never been before, to the most magnificent locations where lifeboat stations were. Baltimore, Cork-Mac-Sherry, and way over to Galway Bay Lifeboat and Valentia Island, places that are a joy to go to. And I was a young person thinking, I'm driving to all these places. I'm going to give a talk. I'm going to show a film. I'm going to bring lifeboat boxes, but I'm not selling. I'm just really enjoying this.
Sure.
And it was a wonderful job, but it didn't pay enough. But as you rightly say, it established me or maybe gave you the opportunity to travel the country and see places. And then those radio stations that we just talked about ended up being a lot of the time covering or being responsible for broadcasting to those areas. So yes, I went to see most of the local radio stations, the parish radio stations as they were around the area, introduced myself and became this broker. So there was a bridge. And what happened with Samaritans was I loved my job as a charity with the RNLI. And then when it came to setting up an operation called Talkback in 1980, well, no, that's true, not true. Set that up in the 90s, but Airtime Limited in 1983 for the radio stations. As time went on, I became interested in this whole idea of meeting more people, interviewing, chatting, listening to people. And Samaritans became a client of mine in the late 80s into the early 90s. From the point of view of their advertising on the radio stations, and then asked me, would I go and see people at their national conference for volunteers and find out what it is. And volunteers, by the way, are people who man the telephones. So
sure,
I'd ring up Samaritans and somebody would be there. And just, it's worth saying, you will never, if you ring from Dublin, you'll never speak to somebody in Dublin. It's more likely they'll be Manchester or Scottish or another country completely. and it's the same way from them to here. Anybody ringing from Manchester won't talk to somebody in Manchester. You'll never be recognised if you ring Samaritans. I say that because it's an important service and it's worth saying.
Yes, of course.
So the national director asked me to go and cover their conference and get some feedback from the volunteers as to why they are volunteers and why they did the job. So that I did very successfully. We got some great feedback and very useful feedback, which helped in formulating training and even some advertising campaign for Samaritans in later years. And at that time, I realized there was a service required or could be looked into for supplying this type of feedback for organizations. And so really in the next 6 months or so, I launched Talkback, which
right.
I still have.
And the sort of premise of Talkback was very much about the ability to listen to what people are saying without sort of judgment or anything else. A valuable service for maybe management in companies and connecting them to their employees.
That's what it's become. And I learned a hard lesson myself, it's worth saying, and against myself. I was at a meeting once with one of the radio stations with somebody else. And we traveled back in the car, we about a 2-hour drive. And he said to me, you really ought to listen a lot better. You were looking out the window a lot. And of course, from my point of view, I was enjoying the location and looking at it and said, this is fascinating, really. But he's right. He was absolutely right. I wasn't listening enough to the person that was sitting in front of us. And it was a big lesson for me. And I learned it and realized after that how much I needed to focus on what was being said, not fidget, not look like I was distracted. And those things apply very much nowadays with mostly with mobile phones or other things, that you need to be very much tuned into what that other person is saying. So I learned that lesson, and I think it went on then to make me think about that. And then when I trained to be a coach, which also helps you to learn to listen very effectively, I brought all that into the Talkback idea and the whole idea of listening to people and active listening, as it's known, and bordering on empathy, which is another discussion that's.
Well, I suppose the core skills we're talking about here is being present and listening to what's being said.
Very much so. And as I say to people, the person that's in front of you is the most important person. And that's in life, business, in any way. If you're in a conversation with somebody, it drives me nuts if a mobile phone is beside you or the other person and you get distracted by it. There's texts going off, and really there's so many ways that we get distracted. It's quite important to realize that that's what's happening and to bring yourself back into the moment, as you just said. Totally agree with you.
Mm. And I mean, you took this core skill and you were able to deliver it for international organizations as well.
Yes, I was asked then by, they won't mind me mentioning it, I think, because I did a lot of work for them and they were very kind and gave me a testimonial, for DHL Air, the airline for all the DHL deliveries. Wouldn't often think about it, but you never see a DHL plane in the air during the day, or very rarely, because they fly at night.
Right.
So that's how our things get from one country to another. But they're extremely busy people. So for about 6 or 7 years, I was really talking to their pilots and engineers and staff, and doing a lot of engagement projects with them and hearing what was going on and listening, and then supplying that feedback back to the CEO and the director of flying operations at the time to see what we could fix, because they were very keen to really to be there for their people. So it was an engagement program, and we were successful in getting engagement, particularly with pilots, from a level of 47% up to 74% over the years. So it was a very successful campaign. And I also learned a lot about pilots and the life of pilots and all that side of things. It was fascinating. But it served to be a very useful program. And they then set up a bigger program out of it, which still continues on now. So very good people to work with.
And I think one of the key lessons learned, and we talked about this before, was how many small things can be rectified quickly that make a significant difference to employees.
You couldn't have put it better, Alec. It is the small things. The big things are the headline grabbers. The big things are, if you're in such an organization, something that the unions get involved in. The big things are taught around boardroom tables and so on. It's the small things. And in my case, one particular one that stands out is the difference between plastic cups and real cups. So
Right.
I just briefly have in my hand a white handled cup here. So when I first arrived into the canteen in Leipzig in Germany to talk to pilots, one of the first things that people came up to me, I've been forward announced, so they knew I would be
Mm,
there, said, have you any idea why we've plastic cups here? We can be here 4 or 5 hours and we only have plastic cups. Is
right.
there any way we could find out why we can have real cups? Because, it's quite difficult. You have to have two. It's a waste of
Yeah.
plastic and all that. So I said, I have no idea. So for the next few months, every time I was there, I would draw on the menu a picture of a cup. This was in
Mm,
Germany. My German was less than good. I would draw a picture of a cup. I'd put in bitter 30 by with a little X beside it, 2300 Danke. And I'd write that on the menu, the paper menu, and hand it back up. And I'd leave it there. So nothing happened for a few weeks. And then I went in there about 3 months later, and I was sitting there. My work started about 10 o'clock at night. And at 11 o'clock at night, out came a tray of spanking new white mugs and
mm.
stuck in there, and 2 trays. And the pilots came over to, 1 or 2 came over and said, do you see those cups? Thank you very much. You managed to fix that. Now, the thing about it was, that was a big win for a very small thing,
Yeah.
but they felt they weren't being listened to. Nobody's taking it on board. And these are the things that make all the difference. And they're never high enough up the radar, and unfortunately get pushed down. You could add on lots of things to that. But that was a small fix. But it was such a big win from the pilot's point of view. They were absolutely thrilled. And of course, the knock-on effect is the company was listening and they did something about it. And that's what mattered.
I suppose this has been core to your skill set all your life, Don, is the ability to listen, be empathetic with people, and to hear what's being said. And I suppose in the sort of last 3 minutes of the show, and maybe you might talk about what's happening for Don in the future as we go forward.
Well, thank you, Alec. Yeah, isn't it extraordinary? We've sped along here because we're so focused really on this conversation, and there's no distractions. I always feel that myself. It's like any conversation at a party or any situation where the time flies. So for me, it's all about active listening now. It's about listening to people properly, giving them the opportunity to be listened to. And of course, the idea is that in the end, we fix things. And in this particular situation where we have now, at the time we are now in February 2021, there's a pandemic on. We're all separated. We're not necessarily forced to work from home. That has quite reached that point now, but we're certainly given the opportunity to work more and more from home, and that's where what people are doing. So isolation is a thing. People need to be listened to, both at home, at work, and so my listening is the business workshop is something I give online and to companies. I've done it obviously face to face when we were able to do that. And there's sessions about that. It's just helping people to understand how important it is and the benefits of active listening to them and to the other person. So that's what my workshops are now, and I enjoy giving them both online and in hopefully again in perfect face-to-face situations.
I mean, we're really talking about the value, and we already identified very small wins with huge paybacks on it. And so therefore, the skill set that you're bringing has a huge payback value for anybody who's prepared to, hey, I suggest have a chat with you.
Yeah, there is that. There's one other thing I would like to say, and that is it's important that we contact people, that we reach out to people and actually don't just text or email or WhatsApp or anything else, but actually phone people occasionally that you haven't spoken to for a while and give them a chance to have a conversation. It's all about having the conversation and understanding that we all need to have conversations. These Zoom sessions, GoToMeeting, whatever sessions they might be, Skype, they're all very useful. They're one-to-one sessions, and we're all talking on one-to-one during those sessions, if you like, even though there's a group. But people do really need to be listened to, and it's important for mental health that people have an opportunity to have a conversation with somebody at least once a day. It doesn't always happen.
I think with that positive message, we'll certainly finish on that. And maybe you might tell our listeners where they may hear more about you, Don, or see more about you.
Sure. I'm on LinkedIn, Don Harris Dublin. I have my website is talkback.ie, which is going to be getting a facelift soon. But I'm looking forward to doing a lot more coaching with people and giving more of the listening of the business sessions, because I'm discovering it's something that's needed at the moment. So that's where you find me. Or as I often say, you'll see my face in any police station.
Well, with that positive note, we'll end the show. A special thanks to our guest, Donna Harris, for coming into the You and Your Business studio today. Thanks also to Sam on Sound. The podcast of today's show will be available on dublincityfm.ie from tomorrow. Thank you for your company, and please remember to join me, Alec Drew, again next week. Same time, 12:30, right here on 103.2 Dublin City FM for another edition of You and Your Business. There we go, Doc.
Good man, sir. Good man. Thank you very much.